Michelle Pokrass is one of the key people behind GPT 4.1 at OpenAI. As a post-training research lead, she played a crucial role in making these models so much better for developers. I'm Jacob Efron, and today on Unsupervised Learning, we dug into everything GPT 4.1 and more. Some of my favorite parts from my conversation with Michelle include the current and future state of agents, whether future models will be purpose-built for different groups. We talked about RFT and what it will mean for builders, and tactics for figuring out what's just out of reach for the models versus way in the future. We also talked about how companies can set themselves up for success with rapid AI progress and what kind of founders will win at the app layer. And we finally hit on what's next for OpenAI's agent products. It was an awesome episode with someone who's helping define the cutting edge. Now here's Michelle Pokrass. Well, Michelle, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Very excited to be here.
Yeah, there's a ton of different things I'm excited to explore with you today around GPT 4.1. You mentioned the model has more of a focus on real world usage and utility and less on benchmarks. And I feel like that's definitely resonated in the Twitter discourse and just people playing around with the model. How do you actually go about making that happen in practice?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the real goal of this model was something that's a joy to use for developers. Often, and we're not the only ones who do this, but sometimes you optimize a model for benchmarks and it looks really great. And then you actually try to use it and you stumble over basic things like, oh, it's not following my instructions, or the formatting is weird, or the context is too short to be useful. And so with this model, we really focused on what have developers been telling us for a while now that they want, and how can we reproduce this feedback. So a lot of the focus was on talking to users, getting their feedback, and then turning that into an eval that we can actually use during research. So I would say there was a pretty long lead up before we even got to model training. We were just kind of getting our house in order on evals and understanding where actually are the biggest problems in our models. And so we actually put this in the blog post, but we have an internal instruction following eval. It's based on real API usage. It's based on what people have told us. And this was kind of one of the North Stars while developing this model.
Yeah, I'm curious because I've heard you talk about this idea of picking evals and basically going to startups and people that are building on top of the API and saying, what are the things that the models can't do? And let's try and hill climb on those. How do you go about figuring out, I'm sure everybody has their pick of 15 things they want you to optimize for. How do you go about figuring out what are the evals that matter? And any learnings on that over the course of building this?
Yeah, I will say it's actually more of the opposite problem. They're not coming to us with I have these 100 evals, please fix all of these. It's more they're saying, it's kind of weird in this one use case. And then we have to be what do you mean by that? And we actually, get some prompts going and figure it out. So I'll say a lot of the legwork has been just talking to users and really pulling out the key insights. There's actually an interesting insight I got recently from talking to a user where it turns out our models could do better on sometimes you want to tell them, ignore everything you know about the world and only use the information in context. This is something we would never see in an eval. Amy, GPQA, none of them look at this. But for this specific user, what's most important is the model will attend only to the system instructions and ignore everything it already knows. So yeah, back to the question of how do we determine what's most important? Basically just see what comes up over and over again in themes with customers. And then we also, use our models internally. And we have a sense for where they're not doing well. And we also have internal customers building on top of our models. So basically all of these things put together make it that's how we determine which set of evals to really go after.
Do you have a request for evals for our listener base? Are there some areas where you're oh, we really would love more, examples or things to test around certain areas?
Yes. Always requesting more. I'm always pitching, we have this evals product where you can opt in and you get free inference on the evals. In exchange, we get to use them. But in particular, the things I'm interested in are more long context, real world evals. It's really hard to make a long context eval. Synthetic evals are nice to target really niche use cases, but if you want to get holistically, does this work in long context? We're kind of, we could use more of those. And then the other one is instruction following. This is the hardest thing to define in ML, I feel. Everyone is the model didn't follow this instruction, it's not good at this, but people actually mean hundreds of different things. And so anything more there, I'm always interested.
Did you have any favorite random evals that emerged in this process? I mean, you mentioned obviously the some examples already, but any that were surprising, I guess, in things that weren't working or you thought were particularly fun ones to hill climb on.
This is interesting. We tested a few different versions of 4.1. and with real alpha users and got their feedback. And one customer just really preferred the first version over the fourth one, which is the one we ended up shipping. And they were the only user to feel this way. And all of the evals were up and to the right between these, and we just could not figure out what it was. And it was just some really niche use case that wasn't covered anywhere.
Hard to please everyone with these models.
It's nearly impossible, but if you make something that follows instructions pretty well, then you can try to please more people by teaching them to prompt better. And then, the fine-tuning offering, I think, is a really great way of pleasing more people.
100%. Well, we'll definitely dig into to both of those aspects, here. I guess, I'm curious, the model's been out for a few weeks now. I'm sure you had all these, and you were obviously testing this with plenty of people, so you had some sense of how people would use it. But then it's always fun to get it in the wild and see, all sorts of unexpected ways. Any kind of unexpected things that it's been able to bridge or solve that have been kind of fun to see these last few weeks?
Yeah, I've really loved seeing a lot of the cool UIs people have been building. So actually, this is something we snuck in near the very end of the model, is much improved UI and coding capabilities. So I've seen really cool apps there. I've also loved seeing people make use of Nano. It's small and cheap and fast. And I think Box has some product feature where you can read 17 pages of docs, and
I know Aaron tweeted some results using the models, and it was pretty impressive uplift in the core product.
Yeah, it's very cool to see. The hypothesis behind Nano was, can we just spur on a ton more AI adoption with models that are cheap and fast? And it looks like the answer is yes. People just have demand at all points in the cost latency curve.
I feel like that answer seems to have generally been yes throughout this. You guys are always cutting prices, and it seems to always keep spurring more demand. I feel like you've been acknowledged by Sam, by Noam, by all sorts of folks as really one of the ringleaders of making this whole thing happen. What is actually involved in shipping a model like this end to end? And what work are you guys doing behind the scenes to kind of make this happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. So obviously, there's a large team behind the scenes, and so we have basically these three models are each kind of a semi-new pre-train. So we have the standard size, the mini, and the nano. So really great work from the pre-training teams and to
what does a semi-new pre-train mean?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's kind of we call it a mid-train. It's a freshness update. And so the larger one is a mid-train, but the other two are new pre-trains. And then my team works a lot on post-training. So we've been focusing a lot on, how do we determine the best mix of data, or how do we determine the best parameters for RL training, or how do we determine the weighting of different rewards? And so back to how this all came to be, I think we started realizing, a lot of developers had a lot of pain points with 4.0, and we went, I would say 3 months in on evals and figuring out what the real problems were. And then I would say the next 3 months was kind of a flurry of training. And so we would just run tons of experiments, how does this data set work? Or what if we tweak these parameters? And then that all kind of linked up with these new pre-trains. And then we finally had about 1 month alpha testing where we were training stuff really rapidly and getting feedback and trying to incorporate that as much as possible.
A part of this, it was gathering these evals. Does it feel like that set of evals is still relevant, or is it now you have to go gather a whole new set of stuff that maybe is the right stuff to hill climb on for, improving upon 4.1?
Yeah, I think the shelf life of an eval is 3 months, unfortunately. Progress is so fast, things are getting saturated so quickly. So we're still on the hunt, as always, and I think we always will be.
I mean, one of the things obviously that's so clear in the model is that you improved instruction following, you improved long context, obviously both incredibly beneficial for agents. I think our listeners are always trying to figure out where are we with agents? How do you characterize today, what does work, what doesn't work? What is kind of the state of the field post 4.1?
I think where we are is that agents work remarkably well in well-scoped domains. So, a case where you have all of the right tools for the model, it's fairly clear what the user is asking for. We see that all of those use cases work really well. But now it's more about bridging the gap to the fuzzy and messy real world. It's the user typing something into the customer support box, doesn't actually know what the agent can do, and the agent maybe is missing an awareness of its own capabilities. Or maybe the agent isn't connected enough to the real world to know, a certain piece of information. So I think a lot of the capabilities are there, but it's just so hard to get the context into the model. And then one area I do think we can improve is like ambiguity. Like we should make it easier for developers to tune. If it's ambiguous, should the model ask the user for more information or should it proceed with assumptions? It's obviously super annoying if the model is always coming back to you and be like, should I do this? Are you sure? Like, can I do this? So I think we need like more steerability there. But yeah, I would say
I feel like we've all worked with interns like that before. So I get that there's a fine balance to strike.
You want some delegation, but not too much.
It sounds like, the underlying capabilities of the models, in many ways aren't being fully shown just because we haven't connected enough context in or tools into the models themselves. And seems like there's a lot of improvement on just doing that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I will say when we look at like some of the external benchmarks for function calling or agentic tool use, and we actually dig into the failure cases, like where our models are graded incorrect, I see that they're mostly misgraded, or maybe it's ambiguous, or maybe they're using a user model and the user model isn't following instructions well enough. Yeah. And so we're actually struggling to find cases where the model actually just does the wrong thing. There obviously are those, but most of the benchmarks, I would say, there are saturated.
I imagine like over the next 6-12 months, a lot of that stuff gets added in, there's more tools, more context. I feel like one of the gaps remains kind of like longer term, task execution. Like how do you think about what needs to be done to kind of continue making progress toward some of these longer, like more, ambiguous, many step tasks?
Yeah, I think we need changes like on the engineering side and the model side. So on the engineering side, we need APIs and UIs where it's much easier to like follow along with what the agent's doing, a summary of what they're up to, a way to like jump in and change the trajectory. We have that in Operator. It's pretty cool. You can kind of jump in and like steer, but you don't have that as much for other things in our API. And so I think that's a core capability on the engineering side. And on the modeling side, I think we need more robustness, like when things go wrong. Obviously, sometimes your API will have a 500 and the model will kind of get stuck. And so I think we're hoping to train in more robustness, and like grit is another way we think about it sometimes.
Another part of the models that I think everyone's noted on, and obviously you have in the benchmarks, is just how much better they are at code. And so I guess, to start there, like how do you kind of, characterize where we are with like what, where we are with AI code, like what works, what doesn't?
Yeah, totally. So I think where we are for code is that 4.1 and some of our other models are remarkably good when the problem is like locally scoped. So maybe you're asking the model to like change some library and all of the files are, near each other and it makes a lot of sense. But we see like the SweBench tasks that we're missing, for example, are those where the model really needs global context. And it needs to like reason about many various parts of the code. Or maybe there's like some extremely technical details in one file and you're trying to pass them into another. So I would say like we're still improving kind of that global understanding. I also think we've made a really big improvement on the front-end coding, but I still would love to continue improving. Like we should not only produce front-end code that's beautiful, but like a front-end engineer should be proud of it. And so there's some linting stuff there, and code style is another top focus area for us. And finally, I think another thing we're always going to keep improving is like changing only what you asked for and not everything else. Like the model should adapt to the style of your code and not kind of inject its own style too much. And on our internal evals, we see, it went from, I think, 9% to 2% from 4.0 to 4.1, these like irrelevant edits. But obviously 2% is not zero, and so it's something we're going to continue improving.
Yeah. What does that mean for how then you end up using it in your kind of day-to-day coding?
Yeah. I, manage a team now, so there's not that much
alas, the inevitable trajectory of doing well at these companies.
But I do use Codex, and I have honestly still been using GitHub Copilot. It's still a great product, and I also dabble with Windsurf and Cursor. So I'm in and out, but Codex is really cool, the way it does stuff independently. And I think the main model I use there is O4 Mini, just for speed.
Obviously you've kind of alluded to this. There's like lots of benchmarks, and I feel like people are always debating like, are benchmarks still relevant? I think you guys even added some, into 4.1. I think there's been this feeling in coding for a while, for example, like benchmarks don't tell the full story, and you kind of like know it when you use it. Like, to what extent is that true? And what's like your overall view on like the state of these benchmarks today and how useful they are?
Yeah, I do think SweBench is still a useful benchmark. Like the actual differences from a model that can achieve like 55 versus 35 are staggeringly different. I think the 8 evals are still super useful. But then there's the ones that are just like fully saturated and not useful. Basically, you gotta like use the most out of an eval during its lifespan and then move on and create another one. And so I do anticipate
the 3-month shelf life definitely is tough.
Yeah, there's going to be successors to SweBench once that's saturated for sure.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I think that's so interesting about 4.1 is that I think you guys have been very explicit. Like, this was built for developers, and like, there's all these like evals you did to make it better for the things that developers were asking you for. And it kind of does beg the question, like, how does the OpenAI model family evolve from here? Because obviously you could imagine like a pre-trained model that's post-trained for different end users or, I don't know, domains or tasks. Like, I'm sure you guys learned a ton, kind of building this model for this explicit end group. How do you think about that?
In general, my philosophy is that we should really lean into the G in AGI and trying to make one model that's general. And so ideally, I think going forward, we're going to try to simplify the product offering, try to have one model for both use cases, and simplify the model picker situation in ChatGPT as well. But for 4.1, we thought there was like a particularly acute need, and we thought we could move a lot faster at this problem if we could decouple from ChatGPT. So this let us, train models, get feedback much quicker, ship on a different timeline. And it also let us make some interesting choices with model training. So we were able to remove some of the data sets specific to ChatGPT, and we were able to like upweight the coding data significantly. And so this is stuff you can do when you're kind of targeting a separate domain. But in general, I do expect us to simplify. And I think the models get better when like the creative energies of all researchers at OpenAI are working on them, rather than, the subgroup focused on the API right now.
Well, it also seems like there's been massive like cross-domain generalization anyway, where, in general, it feels like, putting it all into one model has been beneficial. But it's interesting, obviously, that this has been such a success with that more targeted approach.
Yeah, there's room for both, I think. Like sometimes it makes sense to eject and ship the thing for a user really well.
So you think that's something you guys might do again?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I mean, we don't we make a lot of changes on the fly, like as we see what demand is there, and it's definitely possible.
Well, one thing I obviously hear from folks all the time is you guys ship models very rapidly. I know the naming has always been debated ad nauseum about how many different models there are. I feel like companies are trying to keep, stay on top of like what the cutting edge of model capabilities are. Any best practices you've seen from like, what companies do to like just stay on top of, it feels like a new model drops every like month in this space. And how would you be thinking about it if you were at one of the users of these APIs?
It's all back to evals, unfortunately. Like the most successful startups are the ones who know their use case really well, have really good evals, and then they can just spend, an hour running evals on the new models when they drop. There's also, I think, the customers are really successful are the ones who can switch their prompts and their scaffoldings and tune them to the particular models. So that's what I would recommend. And then the other thing is to build stuff which is maybe just out of reach of the current models. Or maybe it works 1 out of 10 times and you'd love it to be 9. If you have these kind of use cases in your back pocket, when the new models drop and things just work, then you're, first to market.
Do you have a heuristic you use for what's just out of reach? Like, obviously, I feel like it's hard to tell sometimes, like if it's, how soon some of these things might work.
Yeah, I think if you see significant improvements in fine tuning, like let's say you're getting a 10% pass rate, you can fine tune it to 50%. It's probably not good enough for your product yet. That's something that's right on the cusp, and a future model a few months from now will probably just crush it.
No, that makes a ton of sense. I mean, obviously, you mentioned kind of like the being able to switch the prompts and the scaffolding. I think one thing that like I think a lot about on the investment side is there's lots of companies that the models are able to do what they're able to do. There's all sorts of scaffolding they build based around those limitations to make the products work today, and then it feels like you guys release a next great model and some of that scaffolding just gets obviated. It's like, okay, cool. Like the models are way better at like following instructions. I don't need to do all this hacky stuff because you have this long context window now. Given that, how do you think about when it like does and doesn't make sense to like build some of this scaffolding, or like what set of scaffolding makes sense for these folks, for people to focus on?
I like to take this back, I guess, to like your reason for being as a startup. Like your reason for being is to ship value to your users and make something people want. And so I think it is super worth it to build the scaffolding and like make your thing work, you basically are doing like a few months of arbitrage before this capability is available more easily. But I do think it's important to keep in mind future trends. So like maybe build the RAG thing for now, or maybe like have your instructions 5 times in the prompt, although not with 4.1. But just be prepared to change things. But know where things are going. So, I think context windows are only going to keep improving. I think reasoning capabilities are only going to get better. Instruction following is only going to get better. And so just have an eye to where those trends are going.
Yeah. Any other like for where things are going, like tips for folks?
Yeah, I think multimodal is another one. Like the models are getting so natively multimodal and easy to use in those.
Yeah, I feel like that's been a pretty under-discussed part of 4.1. It's pretty impressive multimodal capabilities.
Yeah, honestly, huge shout out to our pre-training teams, because these new pre-trains have just significantly improved upon multimodal. And I think we'll continue to see these improvements. But so many things that didn't work in 4.0 just work now because, the models have gotten better there. And so it's worth it to connect the model to as much information about your task as possible, even if you're getting meh results today, because tomorrow it'll get better.
And you mentioned like fine tuning. I mean, I think it's interesting, right? I feel like we've gone through this journey with fine tuning where, early on, I feel like a lot of folks were like, I don't know how helpful this actually is. And then it feels like there's been a renaissance of fine tuning with these newer models and how helpful it actually is. Like, I guess I'm curious what you've observed. Like, does that arc ring true to you? And like, how should people be thinking about this? And should more people be revisiting their prior assumptions around fine tuning?
Yeah, I think I would bucket fine tuning into 2 camps. The first is fine tuning for speed and latency.
Yeah.
And so this is still, I think, the workhorse of our SFT offering.
Yeah.
So 4.1 works well, but you can get it at a fraction of the latency. But then, I think we haven't seen too much of fine tuning for frontier capabilities. Like you could maybe get them in a really niche domain with SFT, but with RFT, you can actually push the frontier in your specific area, and the fine tuning process is so data efficient that you can just make do with like 100 samples or something on the order.
Yeah.
So our RFT offering is actually shipping to GA next week. I guess your listeners will probably hear about it when it's out. And we're really excited about that. There's some use cases where it works really well. For example, like teaching an agent about how to pick a workflow or how to kind of, work through its decision process. Then there's also some interesting applications in deep tech where, maybe the startup or organization has data that other folks don't have, and it's really verifiable. And from that, you can get the absolute best results with RFT.
I think one thing, that I've been struck by at least is like, it feels like across the board, the number of examples you need is not massive, right? I think in the early days, people, were like, oh, well, like some of these companies sit on tens of thousands of examples and, they'll just be able to outcompete. And it's like, it feels like, the data really does matter, but it's maybe to the tune of a lot less examples than folks might have previously thought.
Yeah, I think these 2 trends are making fine tuning more interesting, where like it's extremely data efficient. And also RFT is basically the same RL process we use internally for improving our models. So we just know that it works remarkably well, and it's less fragile than SFT. And so, for those reasons, I think it's going to be really useful for deep tech and some of the hardest problems.
Is this the kind of thing you think everyone should play around with? Or like, is it like, obviously there's some cases the models can do, but let's take, almost anything that maybe they aren't as accurate as folks want. Is it like worth trying this for any of those cases?
I think my mental model is if it's a stylistic thing, then you should probably use preference fine tuning, which we launched somewhat recently. If it's more simple, like, maybe you want Nano to classify things and it gets 10% of cases wrong and you can close that gap with SFT, that's great. But then for the things where just no model on the market does what you need, then you should turn to RFT.
And it sounds like you were kind of alluding to the fact that there's like some things, especially when they're verifiable, that like make this easier to do. Like, do you have like any rough like rules of thumb you use for like when RFT, the types of domains or the types of problems that RFT will be like particularly effective for? Or like what these more easily verifiable domains are? I feel like everyone's asking this question now outside of code and math.
Yeah, I think there's stuff in like chip design or in biology, just like stuff like drug discovery. I think those sorts of things where maybe you need to explore, but the things that work are easily verifiable. I think those will be good applications.
Certainly chip design is that. I feel like drug discovery, a perpetual awesome use case, but sometimes it takes 10 years to figure out if it actually works in people. So the feedback loop is always obviously interim steps in between. But it's interesting. It does kind of beg the question. I feel like, you see in 4.1, obviously these multimodal capabilities, you talk about kind of the ability to use RFT for biology. I guess there's always been this question of like, are there going to be like standalone types of foundation models, like a robotics foundation model or a biology foundation model that has like nothing or has something to do, but like it's kind of a separate class of models? Like, what's your kind of view on that? Does it feel like it's, you kind of mentioned the G in AGI before. Like, does it feel like we're converging in that aspect?
I kind of do. I think generalization, improves capabilities a lot. I think it remains to be seen with robotics. Like, I guess we'll know empirically if the best robotics products are their own models. But I do kind of think, and I think the trends I see here internally are like combining everything just produces a much better result.
Everyone's teased that you'll have soon, like, one model that will like pick up behind the scenes for people what to use. But obviously we don't have that yet today. And so, I'm curious if I'm a company and, figuring out like which, obviously I'll probably test a bunch of them. Do you have any rough rules of thumb on like which models people should be choosing for the different things they're trying to do?
Yeah, totally. It's a pretty tough decision tree, so I'm excited we're going to simplify it. But here's how I think about it. In ChatGPT, I'm obviously a ChatGPT DAO, and so
you and me both.
Yeah, my main model there is 4.0, and I use 4.5 sometimes for writing or creative stuff, and then 0.3 is what I use for like the hardest math problems, or like I don't know, I was filing my taxes and I wanted them done right, so that's somewhere where I'd use 0.3. Does that line up with you? Are those the models you use in chat?
I wasn't sure the models were good enough yet to trust my taxes to them, so I haven't yet done that. But maybe I should. If you're saying it's good enough, that's great. Next year, I will totally go ahead and do that.
I'm more double checking my CPA, so verify with a trusted source.
But yes, that definitely lines up on the kind of consumer side. And then I'm curious, like for the enterprise users, like how they, obviously I feel like you always want to go as fast and cheap as you can. But I think folks are still trying to figure out exactly like when to reach for each different kind of model.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, how I think about it there is developers should just start with 4.1, see if it works well for their use case. If it does and you're looking for faster, then I would look into Mini and Nano and fine-tuning those. Obviously Mini next and then Nano as the smallest model. And then if some things are just out of reach for 4.1, then I would push for 0.4 Mini and see if you can kind of, get the sufficient like reasoning capabilities out of it. And then you go to 0.3. And then if that's not working, then you go to RFT with 0.4 Mini.
I guess on the other side of using these models, one thing I always enjoy is like the prompting guides you guys release alongside these models, because it's always kind of like funny sometimes, counterintuitive, like the different things that help on the prompt side. Like any particularly favorite things that have emerged is like, oh, that's actually a really helpful way to prompt 4.1.
Yeah, I think we found XML or like structuring your prompts really well, works super well. The other thing is just telling the model to keep going.
I liked that one.
It's something we're hoping to fix for the next one, but it is remarkable like how much better performance you can get by telling the model like, hey, please don't come back to me until you've solved the problem. So yeah, those are interesting and somewhat counterintuitive.
How do you go about you've seen that keep going thing, and obviously in your cookbook shows like a big impact. How do you then go about incorporating that into the next generation of models such that that isn't a thing anymore?
Our post-training process can be pretty sensitive to the exact mix of data used. So, you can imagine a post-training process where you train the model on one diff format, and then, your users are using totally different diff formats, and the model is a bit lost. Whereas for 4.1, we train the model on like 12 or so different diff formats, everything we can think of. And so our goal is to really put out something that works really well, and even document maybe the best one. So our prompting guide has diff formats we found that work well. But we also want it to work well out of the box for developers who aren't going to read our docs, which I recognize as most. You want it to work anyway, even if you're not using the best. So we focus a lot on general prompting and general capabilities, and this way we don't kind of burn in the model a specific one.
Yeah, the keep going is a great thing to say to our team internally too. So it definitely it helps across the board. You've obviously mentioned evals as one thing that like the most sophisticated companies do well. I'm curious if like there's something that you've either maybe some of the OpenAI products or some techniques that like a select few companies are using really well, and you're like, God, I just wish that like thousands of companies were using this or thinking about things this way.
Yeah, I think some of my favorite developers to work with are those who know their problem really well and actually have evals for the whole problem, but can break them down into specific subcomponents. And so they can tell me things like, the model got better at picking the right SQL table by this percentage, but it got worse at picking the right columns by this percentage. And it's like, wow, this level of granularity really helps you tease out like what actually is working and what isn't. And then, they can tune specific parts of this. So I guess like making your system modular and easy to plug different solutions into, I think that takes a little time up front, but makes you move faster in the long run.
I guess a question people are always asking is like, how much AI expertise will like the leading AI app companies need versus just like being good engineers that take your models off the shelf and know their end customer? Like, do you think long term, being able to kind of like have a sense of what data to apply on the fine tune or like, tweak your evals, does that end up being a really important skill set for the app category, players, or is it really like, no, they can kind of take the models mostly off the shelf or, a basic fine tune and the kind of core AI research capability may be less important?
Yeah, I'm really long generalists. So I think people who understand the product are really scrappy engineers who can do anything. Like, I honestly don't think you'll need that much expertise to combine these models and these solutions in the future. So yeah, I'm definitely much more bullish when I hear about a team of like scrappy hackers than a bunch of PhDs with only like research publications under their belt.
There's so many exciting areas to continue pushing these models forward. Like, what future areas of research are you most excited about to like make these models better?
I'm really excited about using our models to make models better. And so this is particularly useful in reinforcement learning when we can use signals from the models to figure out if the model's on the right track. I'm also excited. This is like a more general research area, but we're working on improving our speed of iteration. So the more experiments you can do, just like the more research gets done. And so it's a real focus right now to make sure, we can run our experiments with the fewest number of GPUs and get, you basically want to kick off a job and know when you wake up in the morning that if this thing is working or not.
Is that just like a pure infrastructure problem or like, like the latter part?
Not really. You also need to make sure that kind of the things you're training are at sufficient scale to get signal on what exactly it is you're experimenting with. So also some interesting ML problems there.
Yeah. And then in terms of like using the models to make models better and kind of signals if you're on the right track, like where are we in that? Like, does that work or like, are we still kind of early innings of that?
Yeah, it works remarkably well. I think synthetic data has just been like an incredibly powerful trend. So yeah, excited to push this more, but every more powerful model makes it easier to improve our models in the future. You
guys have also shipped some really interesting, agents. I think Deep Research probably most famously is a product that I use all the time. And basically, as I understand it, like using reinforcement learning like on, a tool or set of tools, right, until the model gets really good at using it. How do you imagine that like type of approach scaling for agents at large? I guess it's kind of like a subvariant of the question we were talking about earlier of like building these like specific models for, end users or specifically doing RL on tools versus like the G of generalization here. Yeah. So I think deep research is like 0 to 1 or deep research and operator or like 0 to 1 or 2 where you want to train the model like really deeply on this specific thing. But I think what we've seen with O3 is that we can just train the model to be great at all kinds of tools. And actually learning to use one set of tools makes it better at other sets of tools. So I don't expect too much of just like one tool-specific training going forward. It's like we've kind of proven that out, and now we can incorporate those capabilities broadly. And actually that's one thing people really love about O3 is that it can do a lot of deep research, like a lot of those capabilities, but quicker and you get it. You can really go for deep research when you want like
the absolute best report. But if you want something somewhere, in between, then O3 is a great fit for that.
Yeah, and as the kind of general models, get better at using tools and and doing some of these tasks, are there areas that you think will like be easier or harder? I mean, obviously, you guys have publicly said you'll have a coding agent. I don't know if there's like, as folks are thinking about again, like what's on the, what capabilities are sooner rather than later. Any just like mental model you use of like, yeah, I think these things would come before the next set of things.
Yeah, coding is obviously coming soon, given like SWE bench numbers are already exceeding, what a lot of humans would get there. So I think the ability to supervise these long runs is there. In terms of other stuff, I think like long workflows. So what's interesting about O3 already is that when it calls developer specified tools, they're already part of the chain of thought of the model. So the model can, use the thoughts of the previous tool call and the output and think some more about what to do. And so I think because of that, the agentic, like maybe customer support or other sorts of capabilities, I think personally are there, and it just need to be hooked up with everything to make a cohesive product.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like in many ways, like the capabilities of these models like exceeds like the actual like nitty gritty just implementation of like hooking them up to things, getting enterprises ready to use them in some way. But it's like, I think there's always this big debate of like if you completely stop model progress right now, is there like just tens of trillions of dollars of value to be extracted from just like from these models? And it seems like you're very much in the camp of yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think about like the capabilities overhang of the internet. We still haven't saturated, like things are still coming online, like the internet is still eating the world. And I think for AI, like we haven't even saturated the capabilities of 3.5 turbo. Like still think there are billion-dollar companies started that only need that level of capabilities. And so now with 4.1 and these reasoning models, like I think we have, if we truly stopped right now, I think we'd have 10 years of building at least.
Sam's obviously talked about combining the model families into this GPT-5 that will probably end the really fun, point this and point that and all that. But like, what actually needs to be done to like combine this into like a single model?
It goes back to like, what are the models good for? So right now, the 4.0 series is really great for chat, and most users in the world use 4.0. So they love the way it matches like tone and style preferences, and it's a great conversationalist. It's good at like figuring out deep conversations with people, or like it's kind of a good sounding board. But O3 has a very different skill set. It can think through problems really hard. You don't really want the model to think for 5 minutes when you say hi. And so I think the real challenge facing us on post-training and research more broadly is like combining these capabilities. So training the model to be like just a really delightful chit-chat partner, but also know when to, reason. And this kind of plays into 4.1 a bit. Like I mentioned that we downweighted some of the chat data and upweighted coding to make coding better. So there are some like zero-sum decisions in that sense, where you have to figure out what exactly you're tailoring the model for. So that's the real challenge in GPT-5 is like, how do we strike this right balance?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because I feel like some reason people have been drawn to different models in the past has been like intensely like personality based. I like the personality or vibes of this model, and I'm struck by, I mean, in some sense, trying to combine it into one model, you get like a median personality. And back to the earlier question of like, I wonder whether longer term folks will want like and maybe they accomplish this through prompting or like through kind of like learning about you, and then the models themselves have all these personalities within them and can kind of emerge. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I already think we're going in this way a bit with enhanced memory. So I think like my ChatGPT is so different from like my mom's or my husband's. So I think we're going in this direction already. It's just becoming so much more useful the more it knows about you. But also the more it knows about you, the more it can like adapt to the things you like. So I think that's actually going to be a really powerful lever for personality in the future. But we're also going to make it more steerable. So we want, you can already use custom instructions and tell the model like, hey, I don't like capital letters, or please, never ask follow-up questions. I don't like that. So I think we're going to lean more into steerability there. I think everyone should be able to kind of tweak for the personality that they want. But yeah, I'm curious, like what's what kind of personality are you looking for?
It's kind of like I'm still discovering, right? Well, I like kind of like the banter is fun, right? And like a little like, kind of like hanging out with your kind of like fun and quirky and like, kind of like almost takes risks sometimes and like the
Right.
stuff they're saying type friend. I feel like I always enjoy that. I guess I'm also curious just to kind of hit on your personal journey at OpenAI. Like obviously you've been, you've done a ton of different roles within OpenAI. You've also like, the company has had, probably a million different subchapters of like growth and experience in your time there. Like maybe just talk a little bit about your like personal journey there. And like also, how is it kind of, what feels similar and different from like, the early days you joined to like now like leading this large team here?
Yeah. So yeah, I've been here for 2.5 years, and I joined on the API team on the engineering side. Actually, a lot more of my background is engineering. I worked at other companies like Coinbase building their like high frequency, low latency trading systems. So a lot more of a focus on like back-end distributed systems. But I did study AI in college, and I worked with some professors there on research projects, and I actually remember using OpenAI Gym at the time, which was super cool. But yeah, I was here for like 1.5 years working on engineering, and then it kind of seemed like it made sense to focus more on the model side for the API specifically. So there wasn't really enough of a focus on improving the models for developers, and I kept hearing like folks wanted something like structured outputs. And so that was kind of the first foray into doing research here. It's like training the model to do that and building the engineering systems. And then after that, kind of formed this team and then moved over to research. And actually recently rebranded my team a bit, and we focus now on power users. So it's the power users research team. And it's the reason for this like rebrand is that we don't just focus on the API. Like, obviously, developers are some of our most discerning power users. They use features that other users don't know about. They know about prompting our models the best. They know the capabilities the best. But there's also power users across ChatGPT. There's some in free. There's plenty in Plus and Pro. And
I'm kind of insulted I haven't been reached out to as a ChatGPT power user. I thought I might have hit the threshold, but I guess there's probably some people that use a lot more.
I mean, yeah, we get a lot of signals from people who are using our models in this way. But also, this is like the reason it's interesting to focus on power users is because the things that the power users are doing today are going to be the things that the median users are doing a year from now. So we just learn a lot from being on the frontier and figuring out what we can do to make the models better for them.
And I guess like what's it been like? Obviously, over those 2 years, I feel like the organization has changed a lot, both in size and the scope of things you work on. Like, what kind of feels still the same, and what's really different, these days?
Yeah, I think the pace of shipping is the same. It's actually remarkable, like how an organization this large can move so quickly. I think some things that are different is you just definitely can't have context on everything going on at the company anymore. It's like, it used to be more possible to like have pretty good state on all of the cool projects going on and read all of their research updates and be intimately familiar. But now you kind of just have to tolerate that you can't know everything cool going on anymore.
Totally. Well, we always like to end our interviews with a quick fire round where we get your take on some overly broad closing questions. And so maybe to start, would love your take on just one thing that's overhyped and one thing that's underhyped in like the general AI discourse today.
So yeah, overhyped, I think benchmarks. Like I mentioned, a lot of like the agentic ones are saturated, or people release like the absolute best numbers they get, but realistic numbers are different. And then underhyped, the corollary of that is like your own evals. And so using, your real usage data to figure out what's working well, underhyped.
Awesome. What's one thing you've changed your mind on in the AI world in the last year?
Yeah, this is back to fine-tuning, but I actually used to be more of a fine-tuning bear because it's kind of like, it's a few months of arbitrage, but is it really worth the time? But I actually do think RFT is worth the time for these like specific domains where you need to push the frontier.
Yeah. Was there like one particular fine tune that convinced you, or like, it was over time having seen this?
I think the cool thing now is that like, our previous post-training stack or like the 4.1 stack is a lot more than just SFT. And so like we weren't shipping how we trained our models. But with RFT, it's basically a similar algorithm as our reinforcement learning. And so that's why I think it's a big shift where you can actually kind of get the capabilities that we can elicit ourselves.
Do you think model progress will be more, the same, or less than this year?
I think it'll be about the same. I don't think we're slowing down. I don't think we're in a fast takeoff at the moment, but it's going to continue to be fast, and there will be a lot of models.
I realize I can't ask you to pick a favorite, but I'm curious if you mentioned this class of kind of harder to solve problems. Maybe beyond enterprise apps, like any kind of consumer products or things that you're most excited about outside of OpenAI, or things that you use in your kind of day-to-day life.
Yeah, I use a lot of stuff that is AI based. Recently, I've been using Levels, and they are have a pretty cool AI focus there. I think Whoop has some very cool health insights as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think taking AI out of just the digital world is super cool.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I want to make sure to leave the last word to you. Where can folks go to learn more about you, 4one, anything you want to point our listeners to? The floor is yours.
Yeah, totally. Thanks. We put out a blog post for 4one if you want to read more about it. I'm also on Twitter, and I love hearing feedback from users, developers, power users. So if something isn't working well in our models and you have a prompt that can show it, please email me. I'm first name at openai.com, and I love getting the feedback so we can make models better.
We'll have to get you on again to talk about the weirdest email you get from us of a obscure use case prompt.
Yeah, I've already gotten some good ones.
Yeah. Well, Michelle, thank you so much. This was a ton of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.